Hello, this is a presentation on my experience in studying the book of Joel, and it's been a very rewarding experience, and I want to encourage you to study this book and to become more active in studying Bible prophecy. So, between the years of 2013 and 2014, I became aware that the book of Joel, which has only 3 chapters in the Bible, is a very important book in the Bible to study. And it really applies to us as talking about last day events. So I studied this very intently. I did line upon line. I compared every verse in the book of Joel and all the words to see really what the Bible was saying. And I was amazed at what I saw. So I started to do some presentations on what I found. And certainly those presentations were the presentations of someone who's new to studying these things and new to laying things out line upon line. So those presentations were not perfect, but they also had important truths in them. So I was blessed, and I found as I tried to share with people my enthusiasm about this book, I met with some resentments and anger, and it was like here was this person who presents present truth, and I was telling this person about what I found, and they had appeared like they loved Jesus and they were glowing with Jesus, and all of a sudden it was like this spirit of anger and resentment came out from them, and it was like not something I expected. And so I observed and I watched and I valued all the different people who were presenting truth and what I was learning at that time. And then I watched and I found that there was a huge separation between those who were studying these truths and they had disagreements with each other. I won't name names, but it was big news for those who were studying Bible prophecy during 2014, and something that I learned from. So one of the things I learned in this process was that I held to the truths around the seven thunders and what the Bible was teaching with that, what the Bible was teaching with Millerite history. And I also held to the truths having to do with 1989 and 9/11. And I was amazed to watch these people who had these disagreements because I observed that the vast majority of them left the truths having to do with the seven thunders, what happened in 1989 and 9/11, or they blew some element of it way out of proportion. And there were very few left who were holding to these foundations. And I was a witness to this. I witnessed this in private chat rooms on Facebook and a number of other places. And I'm going to readjust this here. There we go. And so I'm a witness to that. But when I would share with other people what I observed, when they other people who like had loyalties to some of these different presenters, they reacted to me like, "You're lying. How can you say this because they're not here to defend themselves?" I didn't care to accuse anybody. It was just, this is what I observed. I mean, so it's been a real eye-opener to me how people respond to these things. It's very concerning. So one of the things I learned as I studied is that the book of Joel is that I was actually discovering fractals on my own, and I did not even realize it because no one had used that word before. Fractals have to do with prophetic patterns that occur in a number of different ways in the Bible and how you can lay these line upon line and learn things that apply to our time. Now, this is a very important truth that's come out in the last few years in studying prophecy. So that was one thing I learned. And then also I learned as I studied these things that no one seemed to understand what I found about days and years. So I did a presentation on that. It's on my YouTube site, and it's on days and years. And that's a foundational teaching, I believe, that's important to know about. And then the other thing that's very important in Joel that needs further discussion and presentation is about the Solemn Assembly. The Solemn Assembly prayer is found in Joel chapter 1 and in Joel chapter 2. It's a very important prayer connected with the Day of Atonement, final end time events, preparing ourselves for when Jesus comes. That's been neglected in all the disagreements that have happened. So as I close this video, I would like to suggest that as you read the book of Joel, that you focus especially on the Solemn Assembly prayer and understanding that. And I will work on doing some presentations around that. If you want to study the book of Joel with me, I have a study group on Facebook for this. Also, real quick, this is a picture of the sanctuary, which is part of the Solemn Assembly prayer, the ceremonies that happened during the Old Testament. This is a plaque about the Ten Commandments that someone gave me. You know, it hurt me because there's some things written on the bottom of this plaque that were trying to misrepresent and accuse different presenters, and no one realizes that. When we study the truths of the Bible, we have to be careful how we study these things and how we treat each other in the process. Thinking about my experience in studying the book of Joel 2 to 3 years ago. And so one of the important things I discovered, first off, had to do with the Solemn Assembly. And the Solemn Assembly is connected with the Day of Atonement, with prayer around that. It's also connected with the trumpets in the book of Numbers and in the book of Joel. So there's a connection between a gathering call for prayer and worship, and also there's a connection with a call to war because there's an enemy. So one of the things I found was that there's also a false solemn assembly, and that often had to do with false worship, the tribes around Israel, the Phoenician worship, worship with Baal and Moab and the Amorites and that sort of thing. And a lot of times that worship had to do with prostitution of both male and female children, and a lot of things that were not good. So, also sacrifice, human sacrifice. So, one of the things that you find in studying about the false solemn assembly is that there was actually a king in the Bible who did this. But he started out being anointed by God. So this person is Jehu, and he was anointed at the direction of the prophet Elijah. And the texts for this are found in 1 Kings chapter 19, verses 15 through 17. And then also in 2 Kings chapter 9, verses 6 through 8. And again in 2 Kings chapter 10, verses 11, 19, and 28. So he had a calling of God. And his calling was to be king, and it was to wipe out the false worship having to do with Baal, to wipe out the whole house of Ahab and Jezebel. And he did that. And so when I first read this, it's really brutal. And I thought that this was like, not, how can this be of God that he would have done this? But the Bible is pretty clear that God did anoint him to do that work. So one of the things he did was he had a false solemn assembly. And you find that in the Bible where he, in 2 Kings chapter 10, and what he did was he called all the priests of Baal to the temple of Baal, And he said, now that I've wiped out all of Ahab and his descendants and all of Jezebel and her descendants, I'm going to serve Baal, and I'm going to serve him even worse than Ahab did. Twice as much as Ahab did. So he called them, and as he called them, he gave them a garment, a robe. In other words, a false robe of righteousness, really. It was an expensive robe when you look it up in the Bible and read about it. And he, by his language in 2 Kings chapter 10, was making sure that there were none of God's people in this assembly. So it was a shaking, but it was a shaking where people identified themselves as being connected with Baal worship and not with the worship of the true God. So then he did this, and he offered sacrifices, and then he had 80 men kill all the prophets of Baal. And connected with this, he had 2 decrees. One was in, they're both found in 2 Kings chapter 10, and if you read in verses 18 and 19, and verse talking about the 2 decrees that Jehu had with the false solemn assembly. So I'm going to read from 2 Kings chapter 10. In verse 18, it says that Jehu gathered all the people together, and he said unto them, Ahab served Baal a little, but Jehu shall serve him much. So this told the true spirit and intent behind Jehu, even though his work was anointed by God. Verse 19, now therefore call unto me all the prophets of Baal, all his servants and all his priests, and let none be wanting, for I have a great sacrifice to do to Baal. And whosoever shall be wanting, he shall not live. In other words, whoever didn't show up for this would not live. That was the threat in the call. Okay. But Jehu did this in subtlety. In other words, it was a deception, to the intent that he might destroy the worshippers of Baal. So that was his intent. But in verse 20 he said, and Jehu said, proclaim a solemn assembly for Baal, and they proclaimed it. And verse 21, Jehu sent through all of Israel, this is 10 tribes, and all the worshippers of Baal came, so that there was not a man left that came not, and they came into the house of Baal, and the house of Baal was full from one end to the other. And then after this he brought the rich apparel out that he clothed them with. That's found in verse 21. This is similar to like a false robe of righteousness, at least spiritually or figuratively. And he once again asked them to clearly look among themselves and make sure that there was not a worshiper of God there, because he only wanted worshippers of Baal. And then he wiped them all out. Okay. So this was the work that he did. And I want to come back to a threefold work that occurred. Baal was the second part of this threefold work. If you look at 1 Kings chapter 19, starting, it goes from verse 15 through 17. God commanded Elijah, and he said, return on your way to the wilderness of Damascus, and when you come, anoint Hazael to be king of Syria. This was the first part, the king of Syria. And then anoint Jehu, the son of Nimshi, shall you anoint him to be king over Israel, and Elisha, the son of Shaphat, you shall anoint him to be prophet in your room. And it shall come to pass that him that escapes the sword of Hazael shall Jehu slay, and him that escapes from the sword of Jehu shall Elisha slay. So there were 3 individuals anointed, and they had a work, and it had to do with the 10 tribes of Israel. And Hazael was the first king who had many attacks against Israel. And then there was Jehu. And then after that came Elisha, the work of Elisha. Okay. So this actually happened. An example of this is when you read in 1 Kings chapter 9 and 10,